In modern academia, especially at the pop level or lower tiers of textual criticism, there is a pervasive tendency to treat textual criticism as a purely empirical science. Scholars often attempt to isolate the quote original text by treating manuscripts as detached clinical data points, much like a forensic scientist analyzes DNA. They approach the textual tradition looking for a mathematical reconstruction, believing that if they can just strip away the so called corruptions, they will find the pristine original. However, this approach is built on what we might call the continuous text fallacy. There's an underlying assumption in much of the scholarship that the biblical canon must fit perfectly into a nice, clean, uninterrupted, continuous text. They approach the New Testament with a modern print culture bias, expecting a static reference book. When these scholars find fluidity, modularity, or floating text in the manuscript tradition, they immediately label it as a corruption, an error, or a problem to be solved. But the historic church never demanded such rigidity. For early Christians, the text was a living, spoken reality. They were perfectly comfortable with liturgical selections and a text that breathed within the worship calendar. Manuscripts weren't produced in a vacuum for private, silent study, they were produced by and for the church, primarily for public reading in the liturgy. The Apostle Paul himself commanded this practice, writing to Timothy saying, "Until I arrive, give your attention to the public reading, to exhortation, and to teaching." The New Testament canon and its textual variations can't be understood purely through mechanical textual reconstruction. The canon isn't a scientific discovery. Rather, it's the inherited tradition of what the historical church formally received and actively read in its liturgical life. Tradition isn't just a lens for viewing the canon, it's the very foundation of it. To understand the canon, we have to look at the physical evidence of the manuscript themselves. A massive portion of surviving Greek New Testament evidence consists of lectionaries. Rather than being continuous narratives, these texts are ordered by the church's calendar and its reading cycle. There are over 2,400 surviving Greek lectionary manuscripts, proving that the primary way early Christians encountered the text was through curated liturgical worship. Even when we look at manuscripts that aren't lectionaries, meaning the continuous text type of manuscripts, they're heavily marked for church use. Scribes and lectors added incipits, which are starting words to adapt a reading for the middle of a service, or telos marks, which indicate exactly where a reading should end. They often included synaxaria and menologia, which are essentially index guides telling the reader which passage to read on which day of the year. So the physical evidence proves that the text was living and active in worship. The textual tradition is virtually synonymous with the liturgical tradition. Early Christian literature was primarily intended for public liturgical reading, and this public reading practically drove the physical formatting of the manuscripts. Variations in the text often reflect this living, breathing, worshiping reality of the early church. It's impossible to understate the impact that lectionaries had on the transmission of the text across the board. Without these lectionary manuscripts, our knowledge of the New Testament text would be significantly poorer today. Ultimately, God used the historical, worshiping church to preserve his word through the rhythmic life of the church. There isn't a better example of how pop level academia misunderstands the tradition than the pericope adulterae, the story of the woman caught in adultery at the end of John 7 and beginning of John 8. Textual critics frequently highlight this as the ultimate example of a floating text, a problem piece of scripture that refuses to stay put. In various manuscripts, it's found, again, where it traditionally is found in John chapter 7, or in John 21, or even somewhere in Luke. I experienced this exact academic mindset firsthand during a class I took on the Gospel of John in seminary in college. We were discussing this very passage, and a classmate bluntly suggested that we should simply remove the pericope adulterae along with other debated texts from our Bibles altogether. When I pushed back against such a sterile mathematical approach to the canon, arguing instead for the text's historical reception and traditional use, my professor immediately came to that student's defense, and he actively tried to shut me down, insisting that rigid textual certainty must trump the church's traditional reception. This interaction perfectly encapsulates how modern detached scholarship views the text. We see the pericope adulterae merely as a corruption because it fails to fit into a clean, continuous text. But we have to view it through the lens of liturgy. In the Greek church's lectionary cycle, the Gospel of John was read continuously from Easter to Pentecost. The story of the adulteress ending with John's declaration of mercy. Neither do I pass judgment on you, so go your way, and from now on, sin no more. It interrupted the specific theological flow of the Pentecost readings. So sometimes it was skipped in the primary cycle and reserved for specific feast days, honoring penitents or saints like Saint Pelagia. Its relocation in some manuscripts, like Family 13, where it's placed after Luke 21, isn't a random scribal error either. It fits perfectly into the Holy Week narrative and Lucan lectionary readings, dealing precisely with Jesus' teaching in the temple and enduring controversies with the Pharisees. The text floated because the church was finding the most appropriate liturgical home for a tradition that it had thoroughly received and believed. Scribes were adapting the manuscript to fit the worship calendar rather than forcing it into a rigid, continuous mold. Lectionary reading cycles heavily influenced the transmission and placement of this text. The pericope's reception history and its mobility indicate that it was a deeply ingrained tradition rather than a later interpolation. When we look at the early church, the word canon or standard or rule regarding scripture practically translated to one specific question: what is authorized to be read aloud in the public assembly? Early canonists don't speak of inspired versus uninspired in some sort of vacuum. They speak in terms of church usage. For example, the Muratorian fragment from the late 2nd century rejects certain books specifically by saying that they cannot be read publicly in the church. Later, the Council of Laodicea in 363 explicitly decreed that only canonical books should be read in the church assembly. Now, pointing to councils like Laodicea isn't about claiming that the canon list had to be dogmatically declared from the top down. Rather, it simply demonstrates how the early church thought about what it meant to be canon, which was inherently tied to liturgical reception. This contrasts with the rigid criteria that scholars try to retroactively apply today, criteria that often just doesn't work and ends up being highly subjective. To divorce textual scholarship from the church tradition is simply an anachronism. We only know what the New Testament is because we know what the historic church prayed through and read. The canon isn't just a table of contents imposed from the outside, it is the crystallized liturgical practice of the ancient church. Traditional use and Catholicity, or its universal acceptance, were the true driving forces behind canonization. The Bible is a product of the historic church's tradition and simply cannot be separated from it. So pop-level academia's attempt to blindly piece together the canon through mechanical textual criticism ignores the very mechanism that preserved the text, which is the church's worship. They demand a rigid, continuous text that the ancient church never required and, quite frankly, wouldn't have understood. Manuscript variations like the floating pericope adulterae aren't just errors to be scrubbed away by cold science. They are fingerprints of the church using, reading, and preserving the text in its liturgical life. Ultimately, the text we have is the text that was received. Without the continuous stream of church tradition and liturgical practice, the concept of a canon ceases to exist entirely.